Imagine you are the ruler of the wealthiest trading empire at the height of its power. In your hands is the mightiest fleet. The ships are subject to your will, and the treasury is overflowing with gold that can buy any ally. But suddenly, an enemy arrives that cannot be executed, bribed, or intimidated. An epidemic. It halts trade, devastates cities, and turns your laws into worthless paper. For your people, this is a catastrophe. But for you, it is a unique opportunity. A frightened person is willing to surrender any freedom for a fleeting hope of survival. One decree from you, and instead of prayers, there are checkpoints. And instead of doctors, there are officials with the power to arrest without trial based solely on suspicion. What will you choose? To treat the dying honestly, losing money with strict regulations, or to transform the fear of death into the perfect tool of absolute power that will allow you to control every individual and every ship, even for centuries to come? Now let's take a look at how it unfolded in real history. You open the official archive, find the exact figures in it, and you go to check. You travel to the location. You dig, and you discover that reality diverges from the document by 30 times. Not by 10%, not doubled, by 30 times. What will you do with this fact? Brush it off as an error, or start asking the next question? 3 objects, all famous, all with beautiful official histories. A small island in the Venetian lagoon that few have heard of. The waterfronts of London, traversed by millions of tourists each year. The boulevards of Paris, synonymous with the very word beauty of the city. And each of the 3 has a different story, which lies in the same archives. It is just not commonly acknowledged. These 3 objects are separated by 4.5 centuries. They were built by different people in different countries for different purposes. But they have something in common. Each was constructed in the wake of an epidemic. Each gave rise to a tool of power that outlasted the disease itself. And each still functions, just no longer in the places where they were originally showcased to tourists. You have probably seen some of these objects. You have walked on them, photographed them, admired them. They are beautiful, that is true. But beauty was a secondary result. The main thing was something else. And that something else still works today. Let's start with the smallest object. Venice, the year 1423. The Senate of the Most Serene Republic is constructing a permanent state hospital for plague patients on a separate island in the lagoon. Not a monastery, not a church refuge. A state institution with armed guards and officials at the helm. The island will be named Lazzaretto Vecchio. At first glance, it seems like an act of human kindness. Keeping the sick away from residential areas. Logical. Humane. But the story doesn't end with just one hospital. To manage the island, the Senate established a new body, the Provveditori alla Sanità. It holds powers that did not exist before. To close ports, confiscate goods, and send people to the island without trial, based on the decision of an official. For the first time in history, the state gained the right to dispose of a person's body not for a criminal offense, but merely on suspicion of illness. Prior to this, the sick were cared for by the church, monks, confraternities of mercy, and parish priests. After the Lazzaretto Vecchio, a state official with authority. Ask yourself a simple question. Why Venice? The plague devastated Florence, Genoa, and dozens of other cities. But only Venice was the first to create not a hospital, a state body with police powers. Because Venice had something to protect: trade routes, stockpiles, the reputation of a reliable partner. One infected ship in the harbor could paralyze trade for months. The lazaret is not about medicine. It's customs dressed in a white coat. Quarantine, a word we still use today, originated right here. Quarantena. 40 days of waiting on the water. That's how long ships with suspicious cargo were prohibited from entering the port. 40 days of idleness meant enormous losses: spoiled goods, missed profits, demotivated crews. Wealthy merchants always had an incentive to negotiate with the quarantine guards and return earlier. There are records that this is exactly how it happened. Quarantine was strictly observed by those who lacked money or connections. For the rest, it was flexible. The sanitary magistrate addressed health issues only to the extent that they overlapped with economic concerns. This is not a value judgment in historical terms. It is simply a description of how the system operated. And now let's see how the idea of quarantine evolved further. Venice exported it to other port cities. By the mid-15th century, similar lazarettos appeared in Ragusa, present-day Dubrovnik, then in Marseille, Genoa, and Livorno. Everywhere, the same principle applied. An isolated island or quarter, a government body with police powers, the ability to detain anyone for up to 40 days. The sanitary idea spread faster than any plague. Because it was beneficial for health, trade, and control. The first infrastructure of state oversight over the body spread throughout the Mediterranean in less than 100 years, not by coercion, by voluntary imitation. Now for the numbers. During the plague of 1576, according to the archives of the same magistrate, tens of thousands of the deceased passed through the lazaretto. The official statistics show 50,000 just in Venice. When excavations were conducted on the island in the 21st century, the remains of approximately 1,500 people were found. 1,500 against tens of thousands. Consider the physics of this discrepancy. 1,500 skeletons is roughly equivalent to 2 tennis courts. 48,000 is 30 times more. That's more than half the area of the island, buried in several layers. There isn't that much land on such an island. Historians explain that bodies were burned and dumped into the lagoon, and there were no proper burials. Perhaps. But then, the archival figures are not what actually happened, but rather what was convenient to record. It's important to understand something about the accounting system. The Provveditorato alla Sanità reported annually to the Senate on the work of sanitary control. The scale of the threat determined the budget of the magistrate and his powers for the following year. Large casualty figures, an argument for expanding the office. Small ones, a reason to reduce it. Those who counted had an incentive to count in a certain way. This is not an accusation. It is a description of how bureaucratic systems operate in any era. The more alarming the figure, the fewer questions are asked of those who announced it. Now take a look at what has been found in these excavations. Archaeologists discovered not individual graves, but pits. Deep, rectangular pits where bodies were laid in layers, mixed together, without coffins, without inscriptions, without traces of individual burial rites. This in itself is unexpected. Venice in 1756 was a Catholic city with a strong ecclesiastical structure. To die without the last rites and without a funeral service was not merely a departure, it was a catastrophe for a person of that time. For such burials to occur, there would have needed to be a complete breakdown of norms. Judging by the stratigraphy of the pits, the layers correspond to specific peak months of the outbreak. This allows for an assessment of the actual rate of death, and this rate corresponds to approximately 1,500 burials over the entire period of the island's operation. Not in 1 month, but over the entire time. The rest either remained in the waters of the lagoon or are found in the archival records of the magistrate. Lazzaretto Vecchio is now a quiet museum. Tourists come rarely. The ruins of old brick, the leaning arches, the silence. But it was here that the mechanism was first set in motion, which would be replicated again and again. An epidemic as the basis for a governing body with powers that extend beyond ordinary law. The Venetian magistracy lasted for several centuries. Its model was copied by Genoa, Marseille, and Livorno. The idea that a biological threat necessitates a special government body with unique rights was born on this island. And since then, it has never disappeared. But linger for just a moment on the island itself. After the epidemics of the 17th century subsided, Lazzaretto Vecchio ceased to be used as a lazaret. It was handed over to the military. The island became a gunpowder depot. Then it turned into a storage facility for various military supplies. Later, it became a shelter for stray dogs of the municipal government. After that, it simply became an abandoned plot of land in the lagoon. The medical function evaporated after a century and a half, but the island itself, state property with an armed perimeter and administrative infrastructure, remained. The state never relinquishes islands. It only changes what it stores on them. Look at the map of the Venetian lagoon. Lazzaretto Vecchio is the first lazzaretto. Then Venice built a second one, Lazzaretto Nuovo, on the neighboring island, for those who were not ill but could potentially be infected. 2 islands with guarded perimeters, positioned to control entry into the lagoon. Approaching Venice by sea means passing through both filters. If you don't want to, turn your ship around. State sanitary control over the sea gates of the city. That is what this archipelago really represents. Now think about how this worked in practice. A ship with suspicious cargo would drop anchor at Lazzaretto Nuovo. Goods were unloaded and spread out in the open air to air them out. Special officials turned over bales and boxes daily for all 40 days. These officials themselves could not leave the island. If they did, the entire quarantine period would reset. Thus, in order for the system to work, the state kept not only the sick on the island, but also those who cared for them. The health officials could detain anyone connected to the trading vessel for up to 40 days without trial, appeal, or the right to explain. This was not an exceptional military regime. It was a standard administrative procedure. It lasted for 400 years. 4 centuries later, the same mechanism activated on the other end of Europe, with an incomparably larger scale, and with a far more beautiful facade. But first, let's pay attention to one detail. Venice in 1423 was a city with a population of around 100,000 people. The Lazzaretto was built for this island city, with its only gates, the sea. Mid-19th century London, however, boasted nearly 3 million residents, making it the world's first megacity with a population over 1 million, sprawling across both banks of the river. The scale is 30 times greater. The threat is fundamentally different. Not the plague on incoming ships, but a disease that resides within the city, in its own water. A different infrastructure was needed for such a threat. London, 1858. Summer. Heat. The Thames had turned into an open sewer. Millions of tons of filth, which had been poured directly into the river for decades, began to emit such a stench in the hot weather that the windows of the Parliament building on the banks had to be covered with disinfectant-soaked curtains. Sessions were postponed. Debates were interrupted. Parliamentarians rushed out of the chamber. This event went down in history as the Great Stink. Up until that moment, Parliament had twice rejected the proposal to build a sewer system. Too expensive. Cholera had swept through the city 3 times by then. In 1832, 6,500 dead. In 1848, 14,000. In 1853, another 10,000. 3 waves, 30,000 deaths. And nothing. The budget committee said, too expensive. Then came a hot summer, and the smell reached the parliamentary seats. Within 2 weeks, a law that had been sought for 20 years was enacted. The official story? The embankments of Victoria and Albert are a triumph of engineering. Beautiful granite shores, public spaces, the fight against cholera. All of this is true, but not entirely. Find an old map of London from before 1855 and compare it to a modern one. Just open the 2 images side by side. The width of the Thames in the Westminster area has changed. The river has become narrower. This is not an illusion, it's a physical fact. The shore has been moved closer to the water. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette filled in the shallows, reclaiming 52 acres from the river, that's 34 football fields, and covered it with granite. Beneath the new embankment lies the main intercepting sewers, underground rivers of sewage that carry waste from the entire city downstream. Within the same embankment is the world's first underground urban railway, what would later be called the subway. On the outside, granite parapets, neoclassical lampposts, walking avenues. Inside, 2 parallel systems that are not mentioned on tours. If you find yourself on Victoria Embankment, take a look at the wall. There are doors there, small metal doors embedded right into the granite. Behind them lie the entrances to tunnels, to the second Thames of sewage that flows under your feet right now, uninterrupted for the last 160 years. This is not a museum exhibit. It is an active city artery. Above it, tourists stroll and photograph the sunset over the river. Beneath it, all this time, a machine has been at work that they know nothing about. But look even further at the edges of this system. On the eastern outskirts of London stands the Abbey Mills pumping station, built in 1868. It is called the Cathedral of Sewage, not because someone made a joke, but because it truly looks that way. Ornamental cast-iron columns, wrought-iron patterns, a dome, stained glass windows. Inside, there are 4 steam engines, each given names: Prince Albert, Victoria, Prince of Wales, Alexandra. Royal names on machines pumping waste. In Victorian England, this was no random detail. This is how things that were meant to last forever were designed. A temporary emergency measure gets a corrugated iron shed. A permanent institution, hewn arches and royal names. The very architecture of the pumping station is a declaration of intent. The crisis will pass, the station will remain. And that is precisely how it turned out. The Bazalgette system pumps between 300 to 500 million liters of sewage daily. Not through modernized pipes, through those very egg-shaped tunnels made of Portland cement that Bazalgette poured in the 1860s. Victorian engineering carries the metropolis of the 21st century. Without major repairs, without replacing load-bearing structures, over 160 years in a row. This alone demands an explanation. At the very least, where such confidence in the future came from for a single engineer in the 19th century. Try to imagine the scale of the construction. 318 million bricks, 880,000 cubic yards of concrete, not to mention the granite used for cladding the waterfront on the outside. All this without excavators, without electricity, only steam engines, horses, and hands. 20,000 workers at the peak of construction. Under the bustling streets of London, without halting the city's movement, the work was done by hand, from the bottom up, under the constant threat of soil collapse above. Several workers died. They are not mentioned on tours of Victoria Embankment. Building all this required over £4 million. At the time, this was the annual military budget of a small state. To finance the project, the Metropolitan Works Council was established, with the authority to borrow money, bypassing standard parliamentary procedures. The British Parliament had guarded control over public spending for centuries, a principled achievement hard won in the struggle against the Crown. Cholera became the justification to temporarily suspend this function. Temporarily. But the waterfront remained forever, and the council was not dissolved after the construction was completed. It managed the city's infrastructure for several more decades, with its own budget and powers. The crisis ended. The body remained. Now, look at the financial geometry of this solution. Bazalgette filled in the shallows and reclaimed 52 acres from the river. This new land did not remain vacant. It became developed. The waterfronts of Victoria, Albert, and Chelsea transformed into new urban quarters, hotels, offices, parks, and transportation arteries. The value of London's land was increasing every decade at that time. The Metropolitan Council didn't just spend £4 million. They created real assets from river mud, the revenue from which partially repaid loans. An entity born from an epidemic crisis became the largest landowner on the banks of the Thames. This was no longer an emergency measure. It had become a corporation. Now comes the strangest part of this whole project. Bazalgette built the tunnels with a cushion that is hard to explain by mere engineering caution. The oval shape of the cross-section was designed so that the flow could self-clean under the pressure of its own movement, eliminating the need for flushing. Expensive Portland cement was used, instead of the cheaper alternatives available at the time. And most importantly, the calculations were based on a population 3 times larger than that of London at the time. In the 1860s, the city had around 2.5 million residents. Bazalgette built for 7.5 million. Today, London has about 9 million. The sewers cope, without major repairs. Where did such calculations come from? The usual answer is engineering foresight. Okay, but take a broader look. The same Bazalgette designed sewer systems in other British cities with the same logic, and his colleague William Lindley created systems for 30 European cities, from Hamburg to Warsaw. One concept, one safety margin, one decade, 30 different governments, one handwriting. It's as if Bazalgette was designing not for the city that existed, but for a city that had yet to be built. And one more thing. In the 1860s, the prevailing theory said that cholera spread through miasmas, bad air. This became the official justification for construction. But Bazalgette wasn't building air purifiers. He was building a water drainage system. He acted as if he already knew the truth, that John Snow had proven in 1854 that cholera is a waterborne disease, not an airborne one. Cholera in London ceased immediately after the system stopped discharging sewage into the Thames. The pretext turned out to be false. The infrastructure was real. Look more closely at the timeline. Snow publishes his findings in 1854. The Metropolitan Board of Works is established in 1855. Bazalgette receives the official commission for the design in 1856. All three events occur in 3 consecutive years. The board is created a year after Snow's discovery became known to the scientific community. The design phase begins 2 years later. Yet, in the parliamentary debates of that period, there is no mention of Snow. The official language remains: miasmas, noxious odors, impure air. The theory has already been disproven. The rhetoric continues to thrive. Because noxious odors were something that parliamentarians could sense with their noses, this was compelling argumentation. Disproving the disease of air would require epidemiological data and statistical thinking. Sensing with their noses is simpler. London's embankments are not mere decoration. They are armor. Beautiful on the outside, functional on the inside. If Venice created the first mechanism of sanitary authority over the body, then London established infrastructural control over the space beneath the city, with special financial powers born from a state of emergency. The Metropolitan Works Council, originally created for sewage, gradually took control of roads, fire services, parks, and building regulations. By the 1880s, it managed the urban infrastructure for more people than the population of any other city in the world. The original mandate was sewage. The real scope was everything. The crisis granted powers. The powers found their application. The third case is the most extensive, featuring the most surprising acknowledgement in the original sources. Paris, 1853. Napoleon III appoints a new prefect of the Seine, Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann. The task is formally presented as a sanitation reform, to carve wide streets into the body of medieval Paris so that air can enter the city and centers of disease can disappear. The cholera epidemics of 1832 and 49 took thousands of lives. Something must be done. In 17 years, Haussmann demolished 20,000 houses. 20,000. Entire medieval quarters, some 400 to 500 years old, vanished beneath pickaxes and wheelbarrows. Without excavators, without cranes, only horses, carts, and the hands of workers. Try to imagine this scale. 20,000 buildings. That's not just one neighborhood. It's an entire medium-sized city. It was torn down and rebuilt in 17 years. 350,000 Parisians lost their homes. This is not just a number. These are people who were thrown out onto the streets with their belongings on a specific day. In their place, boulevards. Straight, wide, identical. A uniform facade of light Parisian stone. The postcard Paris that is being photographed now. Official explanation: air, light, health. Miasmas. At that time, it was believed that diseases spread through bad air in narrow alleys. Wide streets are for ventilation. Here is a detail from documents of that time that you won't find in guidebooks. The boulevards were designed with specific military requirements in mind. The width of the street was such that a stable barricade could not be built. The straight perspective was arranged so that an artillery piece positioned at the beginning of the boulevard could fire straight down its entire length. This is documented. Military engineers were involved in the planning. Napoleon III personally made amendments to the designs. After the revolutions of '48, his interests were specific. The Parisian street was to become a place where uprisings do not occur. This is what ultimately dismantles the official explanation. Cholera is transmitted through contaminated water, not through bad air in narrow alleyways. In 1854, John Snow proved this using the data from the London outbreak. He mapped every case and found the source: a single contaminated pump on Broad Street. The epidemic was localized precisely around this pump. When the pump was turned off, the outbreak ceased. The width of the streets has nothing to do with it. When Osman demolished 20,000 houses to combat cholera, the scientific community already knew that this would not help. Construction continued for another 16 years after Snow's discovery. Before Haussmann, Paris was organized differently. The rich and the poor lived in the same building, simply on different floors. The bourgeois occupied the second floor, while the workers were under the roof on the sixth. A physical mixture of different classes within the space of a single building. After Haussmann, the rich moved to one neighborhood and the workers to another on the outskirts. Social segregation became geographical. The center of Paris became bourgeois. This is not a random outcome. It is a direct consequence of whose homes were demolished first. Take one specific street, Rue Saint-Antoine. It was here in 1848 that workers built barricades marking the start of the revolution. Immediately after the Napoleonic coup of 1851, this neighborhood fell into the first wave of demolition. Coincidence? Perhaps. But look at what replaced it. A straight street with a hard surface, 32 meters wide, and 32,000 gas lamps lining the new Parisian boulevards. 32,000. Nighttime Paris became fully illuminated and visible for the first time. The darkness, where one could once gather, move around, or hide, has disappeared. Visibility is also infrastructure, yet its function is often described as fighting crime rather than as controlling space. During the next uprising, the Paris Commune of 1871, the wide boulevards worked exactly as Napoleon envisioned. The troops moved without delay. The barricades didn't hold. Photographs remain. Workers attempting to build traditional fortifications, but the width of the street makes it impossible to create a sufficiently strong barricade. This evidence is not abstract. It is visual, preserved to this day. And where did the 350,000 evicted people go? Osman answered this back in 1860. Paris annexed the surrounding communes. The number of Parisian districts increased from 12 to 20. Belleville, Montmartre, Batignolles, working-class suburbs where the evicted class was displaced, became officially part of Paris. Administratively, this looked like an expansion of the city. In reality, it was a reservation. Workers moved to the outskirts, which only became part of the city when they began to concentrate there. The center was cleansed. The periphery was included. The map of Paris became a map of class settlement. This map was not drawn up intentionally. It emerged from three decisions: whom to demolish, where to relocate, and when to annex. The radical press openly wrote about how Osman built streets for the troops during his lifetime. Surviving participants of the commune understood how the boulevards worked against them. Documents exist. They simply don't make it into tourist guides. Osman financed the reconstruction through a system of loans, which was officially termed otherwise. He established a separate financial entity, the Paris Works Fund, which took out loans from banks on behalf of the city, but did not appear in the regular municipal accounting. In effect, it created off-balance sheet debt. The official budgets looked normal. Real liabilities were accumulating separately. When auditors finally delved into the actual accounts in 1869, they uncovered 464 million hidden francs, beyond the officially recognized debt. The final figure amounted to 2.5 billion francs. When everything came to light, it cost him his position. He was dismissed in 1871, a financial scandal. But the boulevards remained. The sewer system, consisting of 600 kilometers of new tunnels, remained. The infrastructure outlasted those who ordered and paid for it. As always, the beauty of Paris is a byproduct, perhaps unplanned, of another task. The sanitation reform served as a cover for military, social, and financial restructuring. A convincing cover, because the disease was real, the threat was genuine, and people truly wanted someone to take action. This desire was enough to demolish 20,000 homes without much opposition. When the next generation of Parisians took to the barricades on the redesigned streets, the streets were already working against them. The urban layout functioned exactly as intended. The Parisian model spread across Europe at the same pace as the Venetian one, but over decades, not a century. Brussels demolished its central districts in the 1860s under the same pretext: sanitation, air, health. Barcelona built its Exemple, a grid of new, wide blocks, in the 1850s. Vienna constructed the Ringstrasse in the 1850s, a 500-meter boulevard around the historical center, on the site of demolished city fortifications. Everywhere, different architects, different political regimes, different declared goals. Everywhere, one result. Old, densely populated neighborhoods were leveled, the poor were displaced, and the city center was restructured to meet the needs of the bourgeoisie and military logistics. The sanitary idea proved to be a convenient guise. It encompassed very much. Combine the three cases together. Venice is a government authority with the power to isolate anyone without trial, based on suspicion. London is loans bypassing Parliament, an underground network operating for a century and a half without major repairs. Paris is the military geometry of space. the eviction of an entire class to the outskirts, a debt of $2.5 billion that no one has publicly explained. 3 countries, 3 eras, 3 settings. The mechanism is the same. The extraordinary sanitary situation revealed what had been concealed in peacetime. The plague was needed to send a person to an island without trial. Cholera was needed to borrow money bypassing Parliament. Miasmas were needed to demolish 20,000 houses without a referendum. Not a conspiracy. Logic. People are frightened. People agree. Osman did not conceal the military calculation of the boulevards. He simply didn't speak about it publicly. Bazalgette did not hide the safety margin. He just didn't explain where his confidence in the future came from. The Venetian magistrate controlled trade, calling it a concern for health. The epidemic was fading away. The institution remained. The authorities remained. The infrastructure was functioning, only now for a different city and a different century. This is what makes these 3 objects interesting not as historical curiosities, but as working models. The Venetian scheme for sanitary control was reproduced in the 20th century during every major epidemic. The London scheme for funding infrastructure through emergency bodies with non-standard powers is literally the architecture of modern sovereign funds and special economic zones. The Paris scheme of restructuring urban spaces under the pretext of sanitation has been repeated in Brussels, Barcelona, and Vienna, and in the 20th century in dozens of cities across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The models aren't outdated. They have simply become less noticeable. Official justifications have changed. Urban renewal, sustainable development, infrastructure security. The mechanism remains the same. This is precisely why it is important to know the original. If you understand how Venice operated, you see the logic. If you see the logic, you notice when it repeats. Not to see a conspiracy in everything, but to ask the right question. What exactly will remain when the crisis is over? 3 objects provided a concrete answer to that question. Concrete, in granite, in brick, in gas lamps. Still standing today. The next time you find yourself on a beautiful waterfront or walking along a wide Parisian boulevard, remember, what you see on the outside is not equal to what it was built for. Beneath that granite, something flows, and not just water.